Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a pair of heavy iron-studded sandals, pulling on a scratchy woolen tunic that hasn't been properly washed in 3 weeks, and shuffling into line with several thousand other exhausted, underpaid, and deeply unimpressed men who have just signed away the next 25 years of their lives to the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever produced. You are a Roman soldier, and before we go any further, you should probably know you almost certainly will not survive this in the way you're imagining. There's no heroic finale, no golden retirement on a sun-drenched farm, no adoring crowd. There's a ditch, a blistered foot, and a centurion with a vine staff who has absolutely no interest in your personal comfort. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Whether you're tucked up in Sydney at midnight or somehow still awake in Toronto at 2 in the morning. I want to know. You're all part of this. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is somewhere in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, though honestly the exact year barely matters to you right now, because your immediate future looks more or less identical regardless of whether it's 50 CE or 150 CE or anywhere in between. Rome's military machine does not particularly care about the calendar. It cares about warm bodies, strong legs, and an ability to follow orders without asking too many questions. You are, ideally, all 3 of those things. Whether you actually are remains to be seen. Let's begin at the very beginning, the moment this whole miserable, occasionally glorious adventure starts. You are enlisting. Now, the word enlisting carries with it a certain modern lightness, doesn't it? You imagine paperwork, a handshake, perhaps a brief physical. What actually happens when you sign up for the Roman legions is something considerably more dramatic and, if you stop to think about it carefully, more than a little terrifying. You take an oath. Not a polite administrative oath. Not the kind of promise you make with your fingers crossed behind your back. You take the sacramentum, a sacred military oath sworn before the gods, before your commander, and before every man standing beside you in that line. The gods of Rome are listening. The gods of Rome have opinions. You do not want to find out what happens when you break a promise made in their presence. The sacramentum binds you in ways that go well beyond the merely legal. You are swearing to obey your commanders absolutely, to never desert your post, to serve Rome with your body and your will for the duration of your enlistment. In the early Republic, soldiers swore this oath fresh at the start of every campaign season, which gave the whole thing a slightly seasonal quality, like renewing a gym membership, except the gym is a war and failing to show up carries the death penalty. By the imperial period, the oath has become a permanent fixture, sworn once and binding for the full term of service. 25 years for the auxiliary forces. 20 years, at least nominally, for the legions, though extensions were not exactly unheard of. You are 19 years old. Do the math. What you are giving up the moment you take that oath is, in a word, everything. And this is not rhetorical flourish, it is Roman law. Upon enlistment, you effectively cease to exist as a legal person in the civilian sense. You cannot own property in your own name. You cannot make a valid will in the standard civilian form, at least not initially, though emperors would eventually grant soldiers the right to dispose of their military savings and equipment as they chose, which was generous of them, really, given that those savings were mostly earned through suffering. Most significantly, you cannot legally marry. Let that sink in for a moment. 25 years. No legal marriage. Now, historians still argue about exactly how rigorously this rule was enforced in practice, and there's genuinely fascinating evidence suggesting that soldiers formed long-term partnerships with women near their bases, that children were born and raised in the shadow of fort walls, that a kind of quasi-family life evolved in the civilian settlements, the vici, that grew up around permanent military installations. But legally, officially, in the eyes of Rome's administrative apparatus, you are a single man. Your children are technically illegitimate. Your partner has no legal standing. Rome owns your time, your body, your labor, and in no small way your identity. Speaking of identity, let's talk about what happens to the physical version of you in the days and weeks immediately following your oath. The Roman military does not take you as you are. It takes you as raw material and sets about the business of turning you into something more useful. The process begins with the probatio, the physical examination and vetting that determines whether you are actually fit for service. You need to be of a certain height. You need to have adequate eyesight. You need your teeth examined because a soldier who cannot chew his rations is a soldier who cannot march, and a soldier who cannot march is a soldier who is, from Rome's perspective, essentially a very expensive piece of furniture. Assuming you pass, and the requirements, while real, were not so stringent as to exclude large portions of the male population, you are then subjected to a thorough stripping away of your former self. Your civilian clothes come off. Your name is recorded in the unit roster. You are assigned to a century and a contubernium, the 8-man tent group that will become, whether you like it or not, your primary social unit for the foreseeable future. You will sleep next to these men. You will eat with these men. You will march beside these men until your feet bleed and then keep marching. You will come to know the sound of their breathing in the dark well enough to identify each one without seeing their faces. But before any of that, there is the matter of equipment. And this is where things get interesting or heavy depending on your perspective, and mostly it's going to be heavy. The Roman legionaries' equipment list is, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. You receive a helmet, the iconic iron or bronze construction that protects your head but does absolutely nothing about the noise of everyone around you also wearing helmets and hitting things. You receive segmented armor, the larica segmentata in the imperial period, or chainmail, the larica hamata, depending on your unit, your date of service, and what the quartermaster happens to have in stock. You receive a large rectangular shield, the scutum, which is made of laminated wood covered in leather and weighs somewhere in the region of 10 kilograms on a good day and considerably more when it's been raining, which it frequently has. You receive 2 pila, the heavy javelins that are the legionary signature ranged weapon. Each one weighs somewhere between 2 and 4 kilograms. You receive a gladius, the short, broad-bladed sword that is simultaneously the most recognizable symbol of Roman military power and, in tight formation, the most pragmatically efficient killing tool you are likely to encounter in the ancient world. You receive a pugio, the dagger that lives at your left hip and functions as everything from a backup weapon to a kitchen utensil, depending on the day. Then there are the personal items, the cooking equipment, the cloak, the bedding such as it is, the entrenching tools that you will carry everywhere and use constantly, because the Roman army digs things with a commitment that borders on religious devotion. The personal rations, the various straps and belts and fittings that hold all of this together. In total, the pack weight that a Roman legionary was expected to march with is, and this is a number that becomes more impressive the longer you think about it, somewhere between 30 and 45 kilograms. Some ancient sources, and a few modern scholars feeling particularly uncharitable, suggest it could go higher. Gaius Marius, the great reformer of the Roman military in the late 2nd century BCE, is often credited with the reorganization that made soldiers responsible for carrying much of what had previously been hauled in baggage trains. He streamlined the army, reduced the logistical tail, and in doing so created a figure so burdened with equipment that Roman soldiers apparently started calling themselves Muli Mariani, Marius's mules. They didn't mean it as a compliment. Marius presumably took it as one anyway, because the man had exactly the kind of personality that converts mockery into pride through sheer force of will. You are, in other words, a mule, a very well-armed, extremely organized, legally constrained mule who has just sworn an unbreakable oath before gods who are definitely paying attention. And the centurion, we should talk about the centurion, because he is already watching you from across the training ground with an expression that suggests he has seen 1,000 wide-eyed new recruits and found all of them wanting. The centurion is the backbone of the Roman legion in a way that no other figure quite matches. He commands a century, theoretically 80 men, and he does so with an authority that is immediate, personal, and backed up by a vine staff, the vitus, which is not decorative. It is a stick. He hits people with it. He is legally entitled to hit people with it. If you think about the organizational structure of the Roman army, the generals plan the campaigns and the emperors take the credit, but it is the centurions who actually make the machine run. They are the non-commissioned and commissioned backbone simultaneously, experienced soldiers who have risen through demonstrated competence and, one suspects, a particular personality type that finds satisfaction in precision, hierarchy, and the occasional application of corporal punishment. Centurions earned considerably more than regular soldiers. We will get to the absolutely grim mathematics of your own pay shortly. And they had a level of individual authority within their centuries that was essentially absolute for day-to-day matters. If a centurion decided you hadn't cleaned your equipment properly, you were punished. If a centurion decided you had been insufficiently enthusiastic during training, you were punished. If a centurion was simply having a bad day and you happened to be the nearest soldier, well, the vine staff existed for a reason. There is a story, probably familiar to anyone who has spent time reading about the Roman army, of a centurion named Lucilius, who served along the Rhine in the reign of Augustus. His nickname among the soldiers was Ceto Alterum, "Give me another," because he had a habit of breaking vine staffs across soldiers' backs and immediately demanding a replacement. The men eventually got tired of this, as men eventually do, and during the mutinies on the Rhine following Augustus's death, Lucilius was one of the first centurions killed. Which tells you something both about the limits of Roman military discipline and about the importance of reading the room. But that is getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Right now, you are still in the early days of your service. You are learning. You are training. And the training deserves its own quiet moment of appreciation, because it is relentless in a way that makes modern military basic training look, if not exactly relaxed, then at least temporally bounded. Roman military training involved marching, and we will spend considerable time on marching very shortly, because it is essentially the defining activity of your existence, but it also involved weapons drill, formation practice, swimming, and a form of endurance conditioning that was essentially continuous. You trained with weighted practice weapons, heavier than the real ones, so that when you finally picked up an actual gladius it felt almost light. You practiced formation movements until they became automatic, until the shuffle and lock of the testudo shield wall happened without conscious thought, because in actual combat, conscious thought is a luxury you will not have. You also built things. The Roman soldier is simultaneously a fighter and an engineer, and the engineering side of the job is something that surprises a lot of people when they encounter it for the first time. Every marching camp, every fort, every road, the soldiers built it. You built it. With your own hands, using those entrenching tools you are already resenting the weight of. We will get to the specifics of that labor later. But for now, file it away as one of the many unexpected items in the job description that nobody mentioned when they were recruiting you. Here is a pleasantly quirky detail that historians have pulled from the archaeological record and various ancient sources. Roman recruits were expected to be able to swim. Not just paddle across a calm river, actually swim with some degree of competence, because the Roman army crossed rivers with some regularity, and the Roman army's approach to water obstacles was broadly go through it, rather than go around it. If you couldn't swim, you learned. The army had opinions about this, and through all of it, the oath-taking, the equipment receiving, the centurion dodging, the endless training. There is one thing that nobody has told you yet, one thing that perhaps you should have asked about before you signed anything, and that is what your life is actually going to look like for the next 2.5 decades. Because you have just traded your civilian existence, your freedom, your legal personhood, your ability to marry, your ownership of your own time, for a salary that sounds reasonable until you learn how much of it is immediately taken back. A diet that will keep you alive without ever making you happy, and accommodations that would fail the most basic of modern habitation standards. But you are here now. The sacramentum has been spoken. The gods have heard it. The centurion is still watching. You had better start marching. The march begins before sunrise. This is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration. It is simply the operational reality of moving a Roman legion from one place to another, which happens with a frequency that, when you first encounter it, seems almost comically excessive. You have barely finished your breakfast. A handful of hard biscuit, some olive oil if you're lucky, a sip of pasca, the vinegar water mixture that the Roman army drinks with an enthusiasm that can only be explained by the fact that the alternative is water of genuinely uncertain quality, and the trumpets are already sounding. The cornison blows the signal, and the camp, which was a sleeping organism 5 minutes ago, becomes an anthill that someone has dropped a boot on. Everything comes down. The tents, goatskin, heavy, and never quite as waterproof as you would like them to be, are struck and packed. The cooking equipment is bundled and distributed. The entrenching tools are shouldered. Your personal kit, which you have already spent considerable time resenting, goes back onto your body in the particular configuration of straps and buckles that Roman soldiers developed, and that looks, to the uninitiated, like someone lost a fight with a hardware store. Then there is the furca, the forked pole that you carry over your shoulder, from which your pack hangs in a bundle, and which is essentially the Roman version of a hiking frame, except that it was designed by someone who had never heard the word ergonomic and had no intention of learning it. Fully loaded, you step into line. The column forms with the kind of practiced inevitability that comes from doing this hundreds of times, and then it begins to move, and once it moves, it does not really stop. Not for long, not for comfort, not because your feet hurt, not because the weather has opinions, not because the road ahead looks uninviting. The Roman army marches, and you march with it because that is what you do now. The standard Roman marching pace, the passus, covered ground at roughly 5 kilometers per hour under normal conditions. A standard day's march, the iestum iter, covered somewhere in the region of 20 to 25 Roman miles, which works out to approximately 29 to 37 modern kilometers. In a day, with everything you're carrying. On roads that, while genuinely impressive by ancient standards, were still roads made of stone and gravel and not particularly interested in cushioning your footstrike. Historians still argue about whether the distances recorded in ancient sources reflect actual daily marching norms or represent exceptional forced marches that were recorded precisely because they were exceptional. This is a genuinely live debate, and it matters because the difference between "this was routine" and "this was remarkable even to Romans" changes quite significantly how we understand what legionary service actually felt like on a daily basis. What we can say with confidence is that Roman armies covered enormous distances in relatively short periods, and that this capacity was considered a fundamental military asset, the ability to appear somewhere the enemy did not expect you, sooner than they thought possible, was repeatedly decisive in Roman military history. For you, the practical experience of this is less strategically interesting and more immediately physical. Your feet, those poor optimistic feet that walked into the recruiting office under their own power not so long ago, are now making their feelings known in a very direct fashion. The calligi, your hobnailed military sandals, are actually quite well-engineered pieces of footwear, with a thick sole studded with iron nails for grip and durability, and a relatively open upper construction that, unlike a closed boot, allows your feet to breathe and reduces the kind of fungal misery that plagued soldiers throughout history who wore enclosed footwear. Archaeological finds of calligi show a sophistication of construction that suggests the Roman army spent genuine effort getting this part right. And yet, 30-plus kilometers a day with 40-plus kilograms of equipment on stone roads is not something any shoe makes comfortable. It is just something you do. The blisters form, and then they burst, and then they form again, and eventually, after weeks and months, your feet develop a leathery competence that they did not previously possess. You stop noticing the blisters quite as much. You start noticing other things instead, like the state of your shoulders where the furca rests, or the particular quality of ache that develops in your lower back when you've been marching for 6 hours and there are still 3 hours to go. The pack weight is worth dwelling on for a moment because it is one of those historical details that sounds like an exaggeration until you actually try to replicate it, which various military historians and dedicated reenactors have done, generally arriving at the conclusion that it is genuinely, profoundly unpleasant. 40 kilograms is approximately the weight of a large dog or a reasonably well-fed 7-year-old child, except that unlike either of those things, military equipment distributes its weight in the least comfortable way possible and does not offer emotional support in return. The Roman army was aware that this was a lot to ask. The organization of the Contubernium, your 8-man tent group, meant that certain items of shared equipment, particularly the larger tents and heavier communal gear, could be distributed across pack animals assigned to each unit. You are not carrying absolutely everything entirely alone. But the personal load, your armor, your weapons, your tools, your rations for multiple days, that is yours, and it goes wherever you go, which is everywhere, which is very far. One of the more quietly remarkable things about Roman marching practice is its relationship to road building. The Roman road network, those straight, engineered, graveled, or paved arteries that cross the empire and which you can still walk sections of today, nearly 2,000 years later, was not built by some separate corps of professional road engineers. It was built by soldiers, by you, by the men marching along it. This creates a slightly vertiginous conceptual loop. You march to exhaustion every day, and then when you arrive somewhere that lacks adequate road infrastructure, you build the road that future iterations of you will march along to exhaustion. You are simultaneously the consumer and the producer of your own misery's delivery mechanism. The actual process of Roman road construction was systematic in a way that commands a certain respect even through the groan of physical labor. A road begins with a trench, the soldiers dig it, which is where those entrenching tools earn their place in your pack. The trench is filled with successive layers of material, a foundation of large stones or rubble, then smaller stones or gravel compacted down, then finer gravel or sand, and finally the surface layer, which on major roads was paved with large flat stones, carefully fitted together and slightly crowned in the center so that rainwater drained to the sides rather than pooling in the roadway. Drainage ditches ran along both sides. Milestones marked the distances. The whole enterprise was surveyed with instruments, the groma and the chorobates, that allowed Roman engineers to maintain remarkably straight alignments over long distances. Building this in full armor or after a full day's march, or in weather that has decided to express itself through rain and cold, is an experience that the road's later smoothness does not really communicate. The road looks effortless once it's finished. Building it is not effortless. Building it requires digging and hauling and fitting and compacting, all performed by men who would genuinely prefer to be doing almost anything else. But the Roman army does not ask what you would prefer. It asks what you can do, and then it schedules you to do it immediately after the thing you just finished doing. Beyond road building, the Roman soldier was expected to construct the marching camp, the castra, at the end of every single day's march. Every day, without exception. Whether you were in hostile territory or friendly countryside, whether the ground was cooperative or difficult, whether it was mid-afternoon or nearly dark, the camp went up. The same camp, always in the same configuration, laid out to the same plan, with the same streets and the same gate positions and the same location for the commander's tent, the praetorium, always in the center. This standardization was not aesthetic. It was tactical. A soldier waking in the night in any marching camp in the empire could find his way to any position without thinking, because every camp was the same. The construction of the marching camp involved, you will be unsurprised to learn, digging. A ditch around the perimeter, fossa, typically V-shaped in cross-section, the excavated earth piled up on the inner side to form a rampart, adger, into which pointed stakes, which you have been carrying, adding to the weight of your pack, were driven to form a palisade. The whole thing could be erected with practiced efficiency in a matter of hours, which sounds impressive until you reflect that those hours come at the end of a day in which you have already marched 30 kilometers with everything you own on your back. Here is a number that puts some of this in perspective. Estimates suggest that constructing a standard marching camp for a full legion of roughly 5,000 men required moving somewhere in the region of 1,000 cubic meters of earth per camp. Per camp, every day. This is not a small amount of earth. This is a dedication to digging that begins to explain why Roman soldiers were apparently quite muscular in ways that went beyond the conventional fighting muscles. Because you do not shift that kind of volume without developing a relationship with your shoulders and back that is intimate in the worst possible sense. The vitus, the centurion's vine staff, that old friend, was never far away during this process. The standards of construction were not suggestions. The angle of the ditch walls mattered. The height of the rampart mattered. The spacing of the stakes mattered. A camp that was well built was a camp that could be defended, and a camp that could be defended was a camp where people didn't die unnecessarily in the night, and so the centurion who insisted that you do it properly was, in a deeply annoying way, correct to insist. This did not make his insistence more pleasant to receive. And then there was the matter of foraging and supply. The Roman army was logistically sophisticated in ways that often go underappreciated. The supply chain that fed a legion on campaign was a genuine organizational achievement. But the chain had gaps, and the gaps were filled by soldiers going out to find food, cut wood, gather fodder for the animals, and perform the 100 small provisioning tasks that kept the organism of the army functioning. These foraging parties were not rest. They were additional labor performed by men who were already tired, in areas that were not always friendly, carrying things back to camp that needed to be processed and stored and used. You cut wood. You cut a great deal of wood. Wood for cooking fires, wood for heating the tents in winter, wood for constructing things that needed to be constructed. The Roman army consumed timber at a rate that had measurable environmental effects on the regions it campaigned through, deforestation following the army's path the way a shadow follows a person. You are not thinking about the environmental implications of this as you swing your axe. You are thinking about your shoulders. Your shoulders have developed a very clear and deeply unconstructive opinion about the amount of work they are being asked to perform. Perhaps the most quietly extraordinary physical achievement of the Roman military marching system was demonstrated during Julius Caesar's Gallic campaigns. In the middle of the 1st century BCE, Caesar moved his armies with a speed that repeatedly wrong-footed his opponents, covering distances that Gallic and Germanic commanders thought impossible in the time available. Caesar himself was not marching the whole way with the pack. It should be noted, commanders had horses, which is one of the many privileges of rank that you are definitely not currently enjoying. But his men were, and they did it, and the gap between what the Roman army could physically accomplish and what its opponents thought was possible was itself a military weapon. You will trudge across mountains in winter. You will ford rivers that are, by any sensible standard, not fordable. You will march through desert heat and northern cold and through rain that seems personal in its persistence. You will do this not because you are some exceptional individual specimen of physical capability. You are not particularly, but because you have been trained and conditioned and organized into a system that makes the impossible routine through sheer repetition and collective effort. The Roman army does not produce superhuman soldiers. It produces ordinary men who have been made to do extraordinary things so many times that extraordinary stops feeling remarkable. Your feet hurt. They will continue to hurt. This is simply the operating condition of your body now, and there is a grim comfort in the consistency of it. At least the pain is reliable. At least the pain shows up every day. At least, unlike so many other aspects of your situation, the pain in your feet is entirely predictable. The column moves. The road unrolls ahead of you, gray and straight and apparently endless, disappearing into whatever the empire has decided needs your presence next. The man in front of you has a slightly uneven gait, left knee probably the bad one, and you have been watching the rhythm of it for 6 hours and will watch it for however many more there are before the trumpets sound and someone, somewhere, decides this is where today's ditch gets dug. The sun is already beginning its slow afternoon descent. There is still a long way to go. The ditch is finished. The stakes are in. The gate is secured, and the sentries, some of whom, you quietly suspect, are conducting their watch with their eyes closed, are posted at their positions around the perimeter. The camp exists, rectangular and precise, stamped onto the landscape like a bureaucratic correction, and for the first time since before sunrise you are no longer required to be moving or digging or carrying something that weighs more than a small child. You are, in the loosest possible interpretation of the word, home. Take a moment with that word, home. Roll it around and see how it fits. It does not fit particularly well. What you are actually standing in front of, as the last light fades and the cooking fires begin their smoky negotiations with the evening air, is a leather tent approximately 3 meters by 3 meters, designed to sleep 8 men, which it does in the same way that a sardine tin sleeps sardines, technically accurately, but with very little dignity and absolutely no personal space. This is your contubernium, your tent group, your smallest social unit, and your most intimate daily reality. You did not choose these 7 men. Rome chose them for you with all the romantic sensitivity of a logistics officer assigning bunk numbers, and you will now share every sleeping, eating, and breathing moment with them for years, possibly decades. The tent itself, the papilio, which means butterfly, which is either a poetic reference to the way the leather panels spread when erected or a very dark joke by whoever named it, is made of goatskin panels stitched together. It is not comfortable. It is not particularly waterproof in heavy rain, in the specific way that becomes apparent at approximately 3 in the morning when water finds the seam above your head and begins a slow, cold, personal drip. It is, however, yours in the sense that you sleep in it, which is the most powerful form of ownership available to you at this stage of your life. The permanent fort is somewhat better, and we should distinguish between the two experiences, because the Roman soldier lived in both at different points in his career. The marching camp, the temporary structure you've just helped build, is the field experience, the campaign experience, the experience of an army in motion. The permanent auxiliary fort or legionary fortress, the castra stat eva, is a different creature entirely. Built in stone and timber, often substantially and with an eye toward longevity, these establishments could house a full legion of around 5,000 men or a smaller auxiliary unit, and they were designed to be inhabited for years, sometimes generations. The barracks building within a permanent fort, the Cantaburnia block, gave each 8-man group 2 rooms. 2 rooms. One larger room for sleeping, one smaller anteroom for storing equipment. The rooms were roughly the size of what a modern person might call a generous closet, and the 8 of you occupied the sleeping room in a configuration that required either cooperation or a complete abandonment of the concept of personal space. Historians examining the archaeological remains of Roman barracks have noted that the sleeping rooms were simply not large enough to accommodate 8 men lying flat simultaneously without some creative arrangement of bodies. Some scholars suggest soldiers slept in shifts. Others suggest they simply accepted a degree of physical proximity that modern sensibilities would find challenging. Either way, privacy was not on offer. Your bunkmate, let us call him Marcus, because there is almost certainly at least one Marcus in your century, statistically speaking, snores. Not gently, not the soft, rhythmic kind of snoring that blends into the background noise. The kind of snoring that seems to be attempting to communicate something, like a distress signal in a language no one has bothered to translate. You have considered many responses to this over the weeks. None of them are available to you because Marcus is your bunkmate, and you need him because the man next to you in a shield wall is not someone you want to have complicated feelings about. The food situation in the permanent fort was somewhat more organized than on campaign, though organized should not be mistaken for good. The Roman soldiers' standard diet was built around grain, specifically wheat, which was ground into flour and made into bread or hardtack biscuit, or sometimes cooked as a porridge. The military grain ration was substantial in caloric terms and was almost certainly sufficient to fuel the physical demands of the job, which is honestly the highest compliment you can give it. Beyond the grain came olive oil, which served as both a cooking medium and a condiment, and which you drizzled on things that did not necessarily benefit from it, simply because it was there. Vinegar, the basis of that pasca you've been drinking, was omnipresent, both as a flavoring and, in diluted form, as a safer alternative to water of questionable origin. Legumes appeared with some regularity. Vegetables came and went depending on season and location. Meat is the interesting and somewhat contentious item on this list. The traditional scholarly view held for many years that Roman soldiers ate very little meat, that they were essentially grain-fueled marching machines with minimal protein variety. More recent archaeological work, the analysis of animal bones from fort refuse deposits, isotope analysis of human remains from military cemeteries, has complicated this picture considerably. Historians still argue about whether the Roman soldiers' diet was as meat-light as the ancient sources suggest or whether actual consumption was more varied than the official ration record implies. The bones say one thing, the administrative records say another. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, with significant variation by location, season, and the entrepreneurial activity of soldiers who supplemented their rations through hunting, trade with the civilian settlement outside the fort walls, or simply the kind of informal acquisition that armies have always engaged in and administrators have always preferred not to document. What the diet lacked, fairly consistently, was flavor in the modern sense. Not because Roman soldiers had no access to seasonings, salt was issued, and various herbs were known and used, but because cooking in a military barracks was not exactly a culinary art form. You had a small portable stove, a foculus, in the anteroom of your barack block, and you cooked on it with the grain and oil and whatever else you had managed to accumulate. The results were functional. They were hot, usually. They were edible. They were the same as yesterday's and would be the same as tomorrow's. And if you close your eyes and try to imagine eating essentially the same meal every day for 25 years, you begin to develop a kind of retrospective sympathy for the Roman soldier that no amount of reading about military tactics quite generates. The water supply in permanent forts was often genuinely impressive. Roman military engineers built aqueducts, bathhouses, and drainage systems that represented real investment in the physical infrastructure of the installation. The bathhouse, the balneum, was one of the genuine pleasures of fort life, and it deserves acknowledgement as such. Communal bathing was a normal and socially unremarkable activity in the Roman world, and the fort bathhouse was a space where soldiers could clean themselves, socialize, and temporarily pretend that their daily existence was something other than what it was. Archaeologists have found bathhouses at Roman forts across the empire, from Scotland to Syria, and the consistency of the provision suggests that Rome regarded soldier hygiene, or at least soldier communal bathing, as genuinely important to maintaining the functioning of the military unit. Whether this was primarily about hygiene in the modern medical sense, or about morale, or about the Roman cultural attachment to bathing as a social institution, is one of those questions that probably doesn't have a single clean answer. All three were likely in play simultaneously. What it meant for you, practically, was that there were hours in the week when the bathhouse was available, when you could hand over your kit and sit in warm water and scrape the accumulated grime of military life off your skin with a strigil, the curved metal scraping tool that substituted for soap, which was not in widespread Roman use, and feel, briefly, like a person. The vicus, the civilian settlement that grew up outside the walls of permanent forts, was the other great social resource of fort life, and it was complicated in every possible sense. These settlements were not officially part of the military installation. They were civilian communities that evolved organically in response to the economic opportunities created by a large, permanently stationed population of men with some money and considerable needs. Taverns existed in the vicus. Shops, food vendors. The women who formed the long-term partnerships with soldiers that we touched on earlier, partnerships that were real, stable, and family-forming in every practical sense, regardless of their legal ambiguity. The vicus was where you went when your official duties released you, when the centurion's vine staff was temporarily aimed elsewhere, when you wanted something that the fort's official economy did not provide. The vicus was also where you spent money you didn't really have on things you probably shouldn't be buying, which brings us to the economic dimension of fort life and the specific, grinding financial reality of being a Roman soldier. But that particular circle of institutional theft, creative accounting, and pay envelope disappointment deserves its own careful examination, and we will give it exactly that in due course. For now, let us stay a little longer in the physical world of the fort, because there are aspects of daily life that deserve mention and that paint the picture of your existence in colors that go somewhat beyond the merely grim. The latrines, for instance. The Roman military latrine, the forica, was communal and open, a long bench with holes at intervals, positioned over a drainage channel through which water ran continuously, washing the waste away. By ancient standards, this was a sophisticated sanitation solution. Running water, drainage, consistent location. Historians have pointed to Roman military latrines as evidence of the relatively advanced thinking about waste management that the Roman world applied, certainly more systematic than many contemporaneous approaches. Sitting in a row of open holes with your unit mates, however, while water runs past and the man across from you makes sustained eye contact, is an experience that the word sophisticated covers only partially. There was a shared sponge on a stick, the tersorium, for cleaning purposes, rinsed in the running water channel between uses. The germ theory of disease had not yet been proposed. You are doing the math on this and coming to some conclusions that are making you slightly uncomfortable, which is appropriate. The noise of the barracks at night was its own particular experience. 8 men per room, hundreds of rooms per fort, and the acoustic landscape of that, many people sleeping, shifting, snoring, occasionally talking in their sleep, was a constant ambient presence. You learn to sleep through it, eventually, the way you learn to sleep through anything when the alternative is lying awake for 25 years. But in the early weeks and months, the noise of the barracks at night was one of those details that underlined, repeatedly and firmly, the completeness of your transition from civilian to soldier. There was no private quiet. There was no moment when you were alone. The army had consumed your solitude along with your legal personhood and your marriage prospects, and it gave you in return a set of 8 men whose names you now knew as well as your own. Their habits, their fears, their particular flavor of humor, because Roman soldiers had humor, necessarily, the kind of dark and self-aware humor that functions as a pressure valve for people living in conditions of sustained physical and institutional difficulty. Graffiti preserved at sites like Pompeii and various fort excavations gives us flashes of this. Crude jokes, complaints about officers, declarations of affection for women in the vicus, the occasional piece of genuine wit scratched into plaster or stone by someone with a few minutes and something to say. These men were not automatons. They were people, tired and often cold and not particularly well-fed, who found ways to be funny and human inside the machinery that had absorbed them. The watch rotation, excubi, meant that sleep itself was not guaranteed to be uninterrupted. Watch duties came around regularly, pulling soldiers from their beds to stand at the gate or patrol the perimeter in whatever the weather had decided to do that night. watch in a cold northern province, in winter, in the dark, listening to sounds that might be wind or might be something more concerning, is one of those experiences that builds character in the same way that stubbing your toe builds character. Technically true, but not the framing you would choose. And beneath all of it, running through every meal eaten and every night slept and every watch stood in the cold, was the knowledge that this was not temporary. This was not a bad week that would resolve into something better. This was the job in its entirety for the term of your enlistment. The tent or the barracks, the grain and the oil, the 7 snoring men and the open latrine and the centurion's vine staff. This was your life in its daily texture, for 20 years or 25 years or however long Rome decided it needed you. The cooking fire in the anteroom has burned down to embers. Marcus has already achieved full sonority. The sentry outside the barracks paces in the dark, his caligy crunching softly on the gravel. You pull your cloak tighter and close your eyes. Tomorrow the trumpets will sound before sunrise. Let's talk about money. Specifically, let's talk about your money, the coins that are theoretically yours, that have your name attached to them in the regimental accounts, that represent the tangible reward for every blister and every ditch and every night spent listening to Marcus construct elaborate soundscapes with his sinuses. Let's talk about military pay in the Roman army, because it is one of those topics that starts out looking reasonably promising and then, the longer you examine it, begins to resemble one of those dreams where you reach for something and it keeps moving slightly further away. The base pay of a Roman legionary, the stipendium, was set by Julius Caesar at around 225 denarii per year, a significant increase from the earlier rate that reflected Caesar's understanding that well-paid soldiers were loyal soldiers, which was a calculation with obvious personal relevance given the nature of his career. Later emperors adjusted this figure upward at various points. Domitian added a quarter, Septimius Severus increased it again, Caracalla pushed it higher still. So the precise number in your pocket depends on exactly when in the imperial period you are serving. But let's work with a round figure in the region of 300 denarii per year for the sake of illustration, because the exact amount matters less than what happens to it next. 300 denarii per year sounds, when stated baldly, like a reasonable income. It is not a fortune, but it is not nothing. A legionary's pay was comparable to, perhaps slightly better than, what an unskilled or semi-skilled civilian laborer might earn in a year, which at least places you in the vicinity of economic dignity rather than outright destitution. You have, in other words, been led to believe that you are being compensated for your service. The compensation exists. It is real. The denarii are genuine silver coins. Now let us talk about what happens to them before they reach your hands. The Roman army operated a system of compulsory deductions from military pay, deductions, that covered the cost of various necessities that you might, in a moment of optimistic naivety, have imagined were simply provided as part of the deal. Food, for instance. You might have assumed, given that the army feeds you, that the food was free. It is not free. The cost of your grain ration is deducted from your pay. The cost of your replacement equipment, new sandals when the old ones wear out, repairs to your armor, replacement tools, is deducted from your pay. The cost of your tent, that beloved, dripping goatskin sardine can, is deducted from your pay. A contribution to the burial club, the collegium, which ensures that when you die you get a proper funeral rather than being dropped in a ditch, is deducted from your pay. In some units, additional contributions to unit funds for religious observances and the official celebrations of imperial anniversaries were also, you guessed it, deducted. A military papyrus discovered in Egypt, one of the genuinely remarkable documents that survives from Roman military administration, shows the pay account of several soldiers from the early 2nd century CE, and it is illuminating in the most depressing possible way. The document records gross pay received, followed by a column of deductions so comprehensive that the net amount actually handed to the soldier at the end of the accounting period is a fraction of what the headline figure suggested. One soldier in the document, after all deductions, receives a net payment that amounts to somewhere around a third of his gross pay. The rest has already been accounted for before he sees a coin. Historians still argue about whether this deduction system represented a genuine attempt to cover the real costs of soldier provisioning in an administratively tidy way, or whether it was effectively a mechanism for the army to claw back salary it had nominally given, maintaining the appearance of adequate pay while the practical reality was considerably less generous. The answer is probably that it was both simultaneously. a system that had practical administrative logic and that also happened to leave soldiers with significantly less money than the stated pay rate implied, which is the kind of institutional arrangement that tends to persist because it suits the institution. What was left after deductions was not nothing. It was enough to buy wine in the Vicus tavern, to purchase small luxuries from the traders who set up shop outside the fort walls, to send a small amount home to family if you had family to send to. But it was not enough to build any kind of financial security. It was not enough to save meaningfully over a 25-year career, not on its own. This created a structural dependence on additional income streams that shaped soldier behavior in ways the official record often prefers not to discuss too directly. Donatives, the cash bonuses paid by emperors on occasions of military or political significance, were one such stream. When an emperor came to power, it was traditional to pay the troops a loyalty bonus, the donativum, and popular emperors were generous with these, understanding that the legion's goodwill was a political asset with very direct implications for their continued existence. When a general won a significant victory, distributions of campaign booty could supplement soldiers' incomes substantially. These windfalls were real, and they were significant to the soldiers who received them, but they were also irregular and unpredictable, which made financial planning on the basis of them essentially impossible. There was also the question of the savings account. The Roman army maintained a compulsory savings scheme. Part of the soldier's pay was deposited in the unit's strongbox, held on the soldier's behalf, and available to him only on discharge. This sounds like a reasonable retirement savings mechanism, and in some ways it was. It meant that soldiers who completed their service actually had something to collect at the end, rather than having spent everything on wine and dice over 2.5 decades. In practice, however, the savings system also meant that a soldier who died before completing his service potentially left his accumulated savings in a complicated state, and that the money sitting in the strongbox was simultaneously his and not fully accessible to him, which is a particular kind of financial frustration that transcends the centuries. Promotion was one of the few reliable mechanisms for improving your financial situation. The Roman legionary hierarchy had multiple grades above the basic soldier: the immune, who was excused from certain fatigues in exchange for specialist duties; the principales, various grades of NCO-equivalent positions with pay multiples attached; and eventually the centurionate, which was the great financial leap, with centurions earning somewhere between 15 and 100 times the basic legionary rate, depending on their seniority. The primus pilus, the first centurion of a legion, was a wealthy man by any standard of the ancient world. The ordinary legionary was not. Advancement through the ranks required a combination of demonstrated competence, physical fitness, literacy. The Roman army valued literate soldiers for administrative roles, and being able to read and write was a meaningful career advantage, and the cultivation of relationships with officers who could recommend you for positions. It also required simply surviving long enough to be eligible for promotion, which, as we will discuss in due time, was not a guarantee that the universe felt particularly obligated to honor. There was also the matter of what soldiers actually spent their money on in the Vicus, and this tells us something interesting about the psychological texture of military life. Gambling was endemic in the Roman army. Dice games were ubiquitous, prohibited by regulation and practiced anyway, the regulation functioning more as a theoretical framework than an operational constraint. Wine consumption was substantial. The Caponi taverns that operated in civilian settlements around forts were well-patronized establishments, and the relationship between soldiers and their local tavern owners was often one of the more stable long-term financial relationships in a soldier's life, in the sense that the money reliably flowed in one direction. Objects recovered from fort sites and soldier burials reveal a picture of men who invested meaningfully in personal items. Amulets, jewelry, decorated belt fittings, small figurines of gods and goddesses, mirrors, combs, the small material culture of people making their lived environment feel personal within the constraints of institutional existence. A soldier's equipment was officially Rome's. His personal possessions were his own, and he accumulated them with the care of someone who had limited space and limited money but a very human desire to surround himself with things that meant something. The discharge payment, the premium militiae, was perhaps the most important single financial fact of a soldier's career, the deferred reward that theoretically made the whole arrangement worthwhile. Under Augustus, the standard cash discharge payment for a legionary was set at 3,000 denarii, equivalent to roughly 12 years of gross pay at the Caesarian rate. and veterans might also receive a grant of land in a new colony or later in the imperial period, more often a straight cash payment in lieu. This was real money. It was, or was supposed to be, enough to establish yourself in civilian life, to buy property, to set up a small business, to have something to show for the quarter century you had just given to Rome. The problems with the discharge payment were several and significant. First, you had to survive to collect it. 25 years was a long time, and the various ways a Roman soldier could fail to reach discharge — battle, disease, accident, the particular hostility of the empire's frontier environment — were numerous and patient. Second, the discharge payment was not always reliably delivered on schedule. The Roman state's finances were subject to the same pressures as any large political entity's finances, and there were periods in Roman history when veterans waited years for payments that had been promised and not yet materialized. Mutinies, including the Great Rhine and Danube mutinies of 14 CE, immediately following the death of Augustus, were in significant part driven by soldiers' grievances about exactly this: the accumulation of unpaid promises, the extension of service terms beyond the contracted period, the sense that Rome's obligations to its soldiers were treated as negotiable in a way that soldiers' obligations to Rome were decidedly not. There is something quietly enraging, when you sit with it, about the structural logic of your situation. You have taken an unbreakable oath. Your obligations are total and legally enforced. The Vine staff reminds you of this when necessary, and the possibility of very serious punishment reinforces it on a systemic level. But Rome's obligations to you, the pay, the land grant, the discharge payment, these exist in a different register, subject to political conditions and fiscal pressures and the personal priorities of emperors who may or may not have been paying careful attention to what was owed to men who had given the better part of their lives to maintaining the borders of the empire. The auxiliary soldiers' situation was in some ways even more pointed. Non-citizen soldiers serving in auxiliary units received lower base pay than legionaries, roughly 5/6 of the legionary rate in some analyses, though the exact figures are debated, and served for 25 years rather than 20. At the end of their service, they received not a cash payment but a grant of Roman citizenship, which extended also to their children. This was meaningful. Roman citizenship carried genuine legal and social advantages, but it was also a form of payment that required you to be alive and to have survived your full term and to navigate the bureaucratic process of having the grant registered correctly, which was not always straightforward. The citizenship diploma, a bronze tablet documenting the grant of citizenship issued to discharged auxiliaries, is one of the more poignant physical artifacts of Roman military service. Men carried these tablets with them after discharge, kept them carefully, produced them when their legal status was questioned. Copies have been found across the former empire, some still carefully stored in the containers their recipients had made for them. These are real objects, handled by real men, who had spent 25 years in service and received in return a legal status that their descendants would inherit and a piece of bronze that proved it. You hold the arithmetic of your situation in your hands and turn it over. The deductions, the donatives, the saving scheme, the discharge payment that may or may not arrive on schedule, the 25 years that stand between you and any of it. The vine staff of the centurion is currently resting across his shoulders in a way that suggests he is thinking about something other than hitting anyone, which is the closest to relaxed as he gets. The evening meal, grain, oil, whatever the foragers found today, sits in your stomach with the comfortable weight of food that is adequate and nothing more. You are, by any measure, not getting rich, but you are, at least for the moment, alive. The pain arrives before the battle does. This is one of the less discussed truths of Roman military life, that the body of a soldier was under assault long before any enemy showed up to make things officially dangerous. The march, the digging, the construction work, the weight of the equipment carried daily over terrain that was not always cooperative. All of this accumulated in the human body with the patient thoroughness of compound interest, depositing its costs in joints and muscles and bones that were expected to keep performing regardless. You are, in the language of modern sports medicine, chronically overloaded. You are, in the language of the Roman army, fine. Get back in line. The Roman military medical system is one of those historical subjects that provokes a complicated mixture of genuine admiration and profound unease, depending on which aspect of it you're examining at any given moment. On one hand, the Roman army developed a medical infrastructure that was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably sophisticated permanent military hospitals, trained medical personnel, systematic approaches to wound care and soldier health that went well beyond what most ancient armies managed. On the other hand, the tools and knowledge available to Roman military medicine were, by modern standards, limited in ways that matter enormously when you are the person on the table. Let us begin with the hospital, because it represents the genuinely impressive end of the spectrum. The valetudinarium, the military hospital attached to permanent legionary fortresses and many auxiliary forts, was a purpose-built medical facility, a real architectural commitment to the idea that keeping soldiers healthy was worth spending money and space on. The standard design featured a central corridor with small rooms opening off it, arranged to allow air circulation and to separate patients. An approach that, while not based on any understanding of germ theory, happened to produce conditions that were somewhat better for recovery than cramming the sick together in a single room. Archaeologists have excavated valetudinariae at sites across the empire, and the consistency of their design suggests that this was a standard feature of Roman military infrastructure rather than an occasional luxury. The men who staffed these facilities, the Medici, occupied an interesting position in the military hierarchy. They were soldiers, technically, but soldiers excused from regular duties by virtue of their specialist role. The senior medical officer, the medicus ordinarius, had real status and real responsibilities. Below him were various grades of medical assistants and specialists, and the whole apparatus was supported by the institutional recognition that a legion that could not keep its men in fighting condition was a diminished military asset. This is a cold calculation, but it produced warm outcomes, relatively speaking, for the soldiers who ended up in the valetudinarium's care. What the Medici actually knew, and what they could actually do, is where the admiration begins to develop its complications. Roman medical knowledge drew on the Greek tradition, Hippocratic medicine later systematized and expanded by figures like Galen, whose work would dominate Western medicine for over 1,000 years, and it was, within its own framework, coherent and sophisticated. Roman physicians understood the importance of cleanliness in wound care to a degree that, while not mechanistically grounded in the germ theory that would explain why cleanliness mattered, produced practical approaches that were genuinely beneficial. They used vinegar as an antiseptic, that omnipresent Posca vinegar finding yet another application, along with various herbal preparations whose antimicrobial properties modern analysis has confirmed in several cases. They also, it must be said, believed in balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. The theoretical framework underlying Roman medicine held that disease and injury disrupted the balance of these substances, and that treatment involved restoring equilibrium. Bloodletting was a standard intervention for a range of conditions, performed with bronze instruments of considerable elegance and doubtful therapeutic benefit. In most of the cases it was applied to. Various preparations were administered internally on the basis of theoretical reasoning that, while internally consistent, was working from premises that modern medicine does not share. You accepted these treatments because they were what was available, and because the alternative to treatment was worse, and because the medicus had a confidence in his methods that was professionally convincing even when medically questionable. Surgical practice is where Roman military medicine becomes both most impressive and most viscerally challenging to contemplate. The instruments recovered from Roman surgical contexts, probes, forceps, scalpels, bone saws, catheters, traction devices, represent a level of specialized metalworking and functional sophistication that commands respect. Roman military surgeons extracted arrowheads, amputated damaged limbs, trepanned skulls, drilled holes in the cranium to relieve pressure from head injuries, and performed abdominal surgeries, all with bronze and iron instruments that were cleaned between uses in ways that, again, worked better in practice than the theoretical understanding behind them would fully predict. They did all of this without anesthesia in any modern sense. This requires a moment of stillness to fully appreciate. Wine was administered in quantity before procedures, both to dull sensation and to reduce the patient's active resistance to what was about to happen. Preparations derived from plants, including mandrake and opium poppy, were known and used. The Roman medical tradition had access to genuinely effective analgesic substances, but their dosing was imprecise and their reliability variable. The operating surgeon worked quickly, because speed was itself a form of mercy, and because a patient under wine and whatever herbal preparation was available had a limited window of cooperative semi-consciousness before the situation deteriorated in one direction or another. People were held down. This was not a secret or a shameful admission. It was simply the operational reality of surgery performed without reliable anesthesia, and the medical texts describe it matter-of-factly. The medicus operated. His assistants held the patient. The patient endured it or did not endure it, and the surgeon moved on to the next case either way. Infection was the great killer in this context, the consequence that medicine could not fully prevent and could not reliably treat once established. A soldier who survived the battlefield and the surgeon's table might still die a week later from wound infection, from the systemic consequences of bacterial contamination that the most careful ancient wound care could not always prevent. Sepsis does not care about the sophistication of the surgical technique that preceded it. The archaeological record of Roman military cemeteries shows a population of men who sustained significant skeletal injuries, healed fractures, evidence of blade wounds to bone, the traces of hard physical lives, but the soft tissue damage and the infectious consequences that claim so many are invisible in the bone record, their toll visible only in the aggregate mortality patterns and the ages at death of military populations. Dental health deserves a specific mention because it is both relevant to daily suffering and genuinely interesting in terms of what the archaeological evidence shows. Roman soldiers' teeth, examined from skeletal remains, show patterns that are somewhat counterintuitive. The Roman diet, while monotonous, was relatively low in refined sugar, the kind of sugar that drives the tooth decay epidemic of the modern world, and Roman teeth often show less caries than modern populations. However, the gritty quality of stone-ground grain, which left particles of millstone in the flour, produced significant dental wear, grinding teeth down over years of military rations. A soldier in his 30s might have the dental wear of a modern person considerably older, and dental abscesses, infections at the root of worn or damaged teeth, were a source of chronic, debilitating pain for which the available treatment was extraction with forceps, no anesthetic, and whatever stoicism you could muster in the moment. There is something almost poignant about the thought of a Roman soldier, who has survived battles and marches and frontier winters, being laid low by a toothache. And yet this was real. Chronic pain from dental problems, joint problems, old injuries improperly healed. These were the background radiation of a soldier's daily existence, the persistent physical cost of a career that asked everything from the body over a period of decades. Eye infections and diseases were also significant. The Roman army operated in environments ranging from the dusty deserts of North Africa and the Middle East to the damp misery of the northern provinces, and eye conditions, conjunctivitis, trachoma, and various other infections were common enough that Roman military pharmacology developed specific eye treatments with some sophistication. Archaeological finds of small labeled containers of eye medicine from military sites suggest that this was a recognized and regularly treated problem. Historians examining the frequency of eye-related prescriptions in ancient medical texts have noted the emphasis placed on ophthalmic medicine, suggesting that eye disease was genuinely widespread in military populations. The psychological dimension of soldier health is an area where the ancient sources are thinner, but the modern inference is relatively confident. The Roman army did not have a concept of what we would now call post-traumatic stress, but it is difficult to read accounts of sustained combat, frontier deployment, and the particular combination of chronic stress and episodic terror that characterized military life, and conclude that the men experiencing these things were psychologically unaffected by them. There are traces in the ancient record dream accounts, religious dedications, patterns of soldier religiosity that suggest men grasping for psychological anchors in a life of considerable uncertainty, that point toward an inner life that the official military record tends not to document directly. The religious life of the Roman soldier was rich and varied in ways that modern readers sometimes find surprising. Official Roman state religion was present, sacrifices, the veneration of the standards, the celebration of the imperial cult, but individual soldiers also embraced a remarkable diversity of personal religious practice. Mystery religions, including the worship of Mithras, spread through the military with particular energy, and Mithraic temples have been found at Roman military sites across the empire, from the Hadrian's Wall corridor in northern Britain to the Danube frontier and beyond. The appeal of Mithraism to soldiers, its emphasis on male brotherhood, its grades of initiation, its imagery of struggle and cosmic battle, seems legible enough given the context of military life, and it tells you something about what men were reaching for spiritually when the official religion did not fully answer the questions that life on the frontier generated. Quirky historical tidbit for this section: Roman military pharmacology included the use of a substance called acetum, essentially concentrated vinegar, not just as a wound wash but as a treatment for a range of conditions including skin infections, digestive complaints, and as an ingredient in various compound medicines. The soldiers who drank Posca daily were, according to some ancient medical theorists, benefiting from its preservative and antiseptic properties in ways that went beyond hydration. Whether or not this reasoning was medically sound, the practical effect of soldiers routinely consuming diluted vinegar rather than untreated water was probably genuinely protective against some waterborne pathogens, which is one of those cases where ancient empirical practice arrived at beneficial outcomes through a reasoning process that modern science would not exactly endorse. There was also the matter of what happened to you if you were wounded seriously enough to be discharged on medical grounds. The Roman army did have provisions for medical discharge, the missio causaria, which released a soldier from service due to incapacitating injury or illness. The soldier discharged this way received some of the benefits of a regular honorable discharge, though the specifics varied by period and circumstance. This sounds humane, and in relative terms it was, but it also meant that a man who had lost the use of a limb or suffered some other permanently debilitating injury was returned to civilian society with a modest settlement and the challenge of building a life without the physical capacity that civilian labor generally required. The ancient world had no pension system for the disabled in any robust sense, and the veteran who could no longer work faced a future whose security depended heavily on whatever family connections and savings he had managed to accumulate. Across the empire, in the permanent forts and the field hospitals, in the surgical rooms of the valetudinarium and the quarters of the medicus with his bronze instruments laid out in careful order, the business of keeping soldiers functional continued with the quiet determination of an institution that needed its men alive and mobile. Not comfortable necessarily, not free from pain. Chronic pain was simply the operating condition of military bodies, accepted as the cost of the life. But alive and able to march and able to fight, because a soldier who could not do those things was a soldier who was not useful, and the Roman army's relationship with its soldiers was, at its structural core, a relationship organized around usefulness. Your shoulder aches. It has ached since that river crossing 3 months ago when you landed badly on the far bank and felt something shift in a way that has never quite shifted back. The medicus looked at it, pressed it in several places while you maintained the expression of a person who was absolutely fine, and told you to rest it. You have not rested it. There is no resting it. The pack goes on every morning regardless of what the shoulder thinks about this arrangement. You adjust the strap. You take a breath. The trumpets have not sounded yet. For another hour, perhaps, you are permitted to be a body that simply exists, rather than a body in motion. You make the most of it. There is a word in Latin, decimatio, that has given us the modern English word decimate, and most people who use the modern word have no idea what the original actually meant, which is perhaps just as well, because the original is considerably more disturbing than the modern usage implies. When someone today says a sports team was decimated by injuries, they mean the team suffered significant losses. When the Roman army decimated a unit, they meant something geometrically precise and personally catastrophic. Every 10th man, selected by lot, was beaten to death by his fellow soldiers. Let that sit for a moment. Not killed by the enemy, not executed by an outside authority. Beaten to death by the men he had marched with, eaten with, slept beside in the dark, by his contubernium brothers, by the men whose snoring he knew and whose fears he understood. Selected by the blind indifference of a lottery, so that the innocent died alongside the guilty, so that every man in the unit felt the full weight of collective accountability. The decimation was reserved for the most serious failures of collective military discipline, units that had fled in battle, that had mutinied, that had committed some catastrophic failure of the duty they owed. It was rare. It was meant to be rare. Its rarity was part of its power, the way a threat that is almost never carried out can nonetheless organize behavior through the perpetual possibility of its execution. Historians still argue about how frequently decimation was actually employed in the historical record versus how frequently it was threatened, and whether the accounts we have represent actual events or cautionary narratives whose exact historicity is less certain than their moral clarity. What is not in dispute is that the Roman army regarded the most severe forms of collective punishment as legitimate tools of command, and that the soldiers who served in it lived with that knowledge as part of the background architecture of their existence. The punishment apparatus of the Roman military was not a peripheral feature of the institution. It was structural, foundational, and pervasive in ways that shaped daily life whether or not the vine staff was currently making contact with anyone. Let us work our way up through the hierarchy of punishment, because decimation, dramatic as it is, represents the extreme end of a spectrum that began with considerably more routine forms of institutional suffering. At the mild end, mild being relative, as always, was the assignment of extra duties. If you had failed in some minor respect, if your equipment was found wanting at inspection, if you had been insufficiently prompt in responding to an order, you might find yourself assigned to additional fatigues, more digging, latrine cleaning, the least desirable tasks that the unit needed performed. This was the background hum of military discipline, so routine as to be almost unremarkable, the institutional equivalent of a raised eyebrow that nonetheless carried material consequences for your comfort and your sleep. The vitus, the centurion's vine staff, represented the next level, the application of direct physical punishment to the individual soldier. A centurion was legally entitled to beat soldiers under his command for disciplinary infractions, and this authority was exercised with a regularity that the sources make clear was not exceptional. The vine staff was specifically the centurion's instrument. It distinguished him from ordinary soldiers and from higher officers, and its use was so normalized that the man we met earlier, Lucilius Ceto Alterum, was remarkable not for beating soldiers but for the industrial rate at which he got through the equipment doing so. A beating with a vine staff was painful, potentially damaging, and thoroughly humiliating in the social context of a unit where everyone watched and everyone knew. It was not, however, life-threatening in the way that more serious punishments were. Reduction in rank or pay was another instrument, targeting the economic self-interest that the army had carefully cultivated through its pay system. Having worked your way up to a position with a pay multiple, having achieved the small financial elevation of a principales grade, with its fraction more of the already modest salary, losing it through disciplinary action was a specifically targeted pain. The army reaching back through the deduction system to hurt you in the place you could least afford. Confiscation of equipment, assignment to the most dangerous positions in formation, denial of leave. These were the tools of a graduated punishment system that was sophisticated precisely because it had so many levers to pull. The fustuarium occupied a particularly grim space in this hierarchy. This was the beating to death of a single soldier by his fellow soldiers, distinct from decimation in that it targeted an individual for a specific personal failure rather than being applied collectively by lot. The offenses that triggered the fustuarium included falling asleep on watch, stealing from fellow soldiers, bearing false witness in a military context, and this one has a particular quality, being found to have committed the same minor infraction 3 times after having been formally warned twice. Rome was, in its disciplinary architecture, a great believer in second chances, and then third chances, and then absolutely not a fourth chance under any circumstances. The logic of the fustuarium was the same logic that underpinned the entire Roman punishment system: collective responsibility and collective enforcement. The soldier selected for execution by beating was run through a gauntlet of his unit, who were expected to participate actively in his death. Those who struck feebly or seemed to hold back were themselves liable to punishment. The army required not just compliance but performed compliance. You were not permitted to privately disapprove while publicly going through the motions. The institution demanded your genuine participation in its machinery, even when that machinery was grinding one of your companions. This is, to put it plainly, a request that sits in a very dark place psychologically, and the modern reader instinctively reaches for some framework to explain how ordinary men participated in these events. Obedience research, social conformity, the dissolution of individual moral agency in institutional contexts. These are the vocabularies we have for understanding how people do things within systems that they would never contemplate doing as individuals. The Roman soldier had no access to these vocabularies, but he lived their subject matter every day, and the punishment system was one of the places where the army's claim on his entire self. Not just his labor but his violence, his participation, his performed loyalty was most starkly expressed. Reduction to the ranks, missio ignominiosa, was a form of dishonorable discharge that stripped a soldier of all benefits, all savings accrued, all the accumulated credit of his service, and expelled him from the army without the legal protections that honorable service conferred. A soldier discharged this way was returned to civilian life with nothing, not the discharge payment, not the citizenship grant if he was an auxiliary, not even the social standing that came with having served. It was the institutional equivalent of being erased, the Army's statement that your service had been so comprehensively failed as to cancel its obligations in return. The specific rules around what constituted punishable behavior in the Roman army are preserved in sources including the military manuals and legal texts, and they reveal an institution of considerable regulatory ambition. Soldiers were prohibited from engaging in trade while on active service. The prohibition was not always effective, given the evidence of soldiers participating in commercial activity, but it existed. Soldiers were prohibited from certain categories of legal action, from making wills in standard civilian form without special provision, from a range of activities that Rome classified as incompatible with the focus and discipline of military service. Even the personal behavior of soldiers in the vicus was theoretically subject to military discipline in ways that the boundary between soldier and civilian life did not fully resolve. The camp prefect, the praefectus castrorum, was responsible for the administrative and disciplinary machinery of the fortress, and his role in maintaining the punishment system was one of considerable practical authority. Above him, the legionary legate and ultimately the provincial governor had the power of life and death over soldiers, the ius gladii, the right of the sword, that could be exercised in cases of capital offenses. Desertion was a capital offense. Striking a superior officer was a capital offense. Treason, obviously, was a capital offense. The list of ways a soldier could earn a death sentence was not short, and the Roman military justice system did not particularly emphasize the presumption of innocence in its procedural architecture. Here is a detail that lands with a particular quality when you sit with it. The Roman army crucified deserters. Crucifixion, the execution method most familiar to modern audiences through its religious context, was in Roman practice a punishment used specifically against non-citizens and against slaves, and against deserters regardless of their citizen status, because desertion placed a soldier outside the protection that citizenship would otherwise have provided. A soldier who fled and was recaptured could be put to death in the manner reserved for the lowest categories of Roman society, which was itself a statement about what desertion meant to Rome. Not merely a crime but a form of self-disenfranchisement, a voluntary exit from the community of persons to whom Rome owed any obligation. The management of this entire disciplinary system at the unit level fell, in practical terms, on the centurions, and this helps explain both their authority and the particular quality of their relationship with the men they commanded. The centurion who was too lenient was failing in his duty, allowing the disciplinary fabric of the unit to loosen in ways that would eventually cost lives, because a unit that did not hold together under fire was a unit that got people killed. The centurion who was too harsh, our friend Lucilius Ceto Alterum being the cautionary tale, risked the kind of backlash that the Rhine mutinies demonstrated was available to soldiers pushed far enough. The centurionate required a specific calibration of authority, a judgment about how much pressure the unit could bear and how to apply it to produce performance rather than rebellion. Some centurions were genuinely excellent at this. The archaeological and literary record preserves traces of centurions who were respected, even loved, by their men. Soldiers who left dedicatory inscriptions to their commanders, who served willingly under officers they trusted, who formed the kind of unit cohesion that the Roman military system was designed to produce. The relationship between a good centurion and his century had something of the quality of what modern military psychology describes as transformational leadership, not compliance through fear alone, but commitment through the demonstrated competence and care of the leader. Others were Lucilius. The space between these two poles was where you lived, navigating the disciplinary landscape with the specific alertness of someone who knew that the rules were real, the enforcement was immediate, and the consequences of miscalculation were physical and permanent. You learned to read your centurion the way you learned to read whether the small signs that preceded a storm, the particular set of the jaw that meant the vine staff was thinking about moving, The days when something had gone wrong higher up in the command structure and the mood was filtering down through the ranks in the way that institutional bad temper always does. You did not complain. Complaint, formal complaint, the kind that went up the command chain, was possible in theory, and the Roman military legal system had mechanisms for addressing soldier grievances, including abuse by officers. A centurion who went genuinely, egregiously beyond his authority could theoretically be reported and punished. In practice, the power differential between an ordinary soldier and his centurion was considerable, and the social costs of being known as someone who reported his commander were significant in an institution where the opinion of your immediate superiors controlled virtually every aspect of your existence. Men endured a great deal before they reached the threshold of formal complaint. Some never reached it, no matter how much was asked of them. The punishment system was, in its totality, an expression of something the Roman army believed very deeply, that the unit mattered more than the individual, that collective performance justified collective accountability, and that the mechanisms of institutional violence could be turned inward, against the army's own members, with the same efficiency that they were turned outward against the empire's enemies. This was not a moral failing by the army's own standards. It was a design principle carefully implemented and continuously maintained. You understand this. You have understood it since the day you took the sacramentum and felt the weight of the oath settle on you like armor. Present, permanent, not to be removed at your convenience. The oath bound you to Rome. The discipline system ensured that the binding held. Together they created a soldier. Whether they created a person is a question the Roman army did not consider its responsibility to answer. The centurion is watching. You straighten up. You make sure your equipment is correctly arranged. You meet his gaze for precisely the amount of time that is respectful without being challenging. And then you look forward, because forward is where the Roman soldier looks. Always forward. The battle begins with waiting. This is the detail that every heroic account of ancient warfare quietly omits. The hours, sometimes the entire day, spent standing in formation under the weight of your equipment while the two sides arrange themselves, while commanders confer and auguries are taken and the tactical situation resolves itself with geological slowness into something that can actually be acted upon. You stand. Your shoulders ache. Remember the shoulder, that reliable companion, and the sun moves across the sky with what feels like personal indifference to your situation, and the enemy is visible across the field as a mass of movement and noise and the occasional glint of metal, and you wait. Waiting before battle is its own specific psychological experience, distinct from the waiting of the frontier watch or the waiting of the march. This waiting has a destination. Everyone present knows what is coming, and the knowledge sits in the chest with a particular weight that is not quite fear and not quite excitement and is in practice the compound of both. The body's preparatory systems firing up for violence while the mind attempts to maintain some functional relationship with the present moment. You talk to the man beside you if talking is permitted, or you are quiet if it is not, and you listen to the sounds of the army around you, the shuffle of feet, the clink of equipment, the low murmur of tens of thousands of men in various states of the same complicated readiness. The Roman battle formation was built around the principle of controlled, organized violence. Violence as a system rather than an event, the application of collective force in a structured and sustainable way that could be maintained under pressure and adapted to circumstances. The basic unit of tactical deployment was the cohort, 10 cohorts per legion, each cohort consisting of several centuries, and the legion deployed in a formation that presented an organized front while maintaining depth and reserves. The three-line system, the triplex aces, placed cohorts in three staggered lines, the first engaging, the second ready to rotate in or plug gaps, the third held as a strategic reserve. You are, in all likelihood, standing in the first line. The mechanics of what happens next are worth understanding in some detail, because the experience of Roman close-order combat is one of those things that popular imagination tends to reconstruct as a series of individual heroic duels. Gladiatorial, athletic, clean, when the reality was considerably more collective and considerably less clean in almost every sense. The advance begins on command. The line moves forward with the disciplined pace of men who have drilled this movement until it happened in their sleep, the shields locked, the formation maintaining its dressing across the ground, which is not flat, which has irregularities and slopes and patches of mud. And maintaining formation across real terrain requires the specific attention of every man in the line simultaneously, each one watching his neighbors, adjusting, keeping the front coherent. This is the thing that all those hours of training were for. Not individual fighting skill, though that matters, but the ability to maintain the collective shape of the formation under the conditions of real movement toward real violence. At a distance of perhaps 30 meters from the enemy line, the pila are thrown. Both of yours in rapid succession, the first volley, then the second, the heavy javelins arcing into the opposing formation with a force that was designed not just to kill but to disable. The pilum had a specific engineering feature that made it particularly effective: a long, thin iron shank attached to the wooden shaft, designed to bend on impact so that the javelin could not be thrown back, and so that a pilum that lodged in an enemy shield, which it frequently did, dragged the shield down with its weight, forcing the holder to either drop it or be pulled off balance. This was intentional. The Romans engineered their javelin to create disorder in the opposing line at the moment just before contact. Then the lines hit each other. The word hit is accurate and inadequate simultaneously. The collision of two formed bodies of men in close-order battle produces a physical shock. A literal impact, the front ranks pressing into each other, shields meeting shields with a crash that you feel through your entire body. Followed immediately by a sustained press, a grinding, pushing, shoving engagement in which the weight of the formation behind you is as important as your individual strength. This is not a duel. This is more like a collective wrestling match with weapons, in a space so compressed that your elbow has approximately 6 inches of lateral movement and the man behind you is close enough that you can feel his breath on your neck and the pressure of his shield against your back. In this space, the gladius becomes what it was designed to be. Short, about 50 centimeters of blade, and broad, it was not a weapon for the sweeping cuts of open space combat. In the press of the shield wall, there was no room for sweeping cuts. The gladius was used for thrusting short controlled stabs into the gaps that appeared between shields, at the thigh, at the armpit, at the throat, the gaps that opened and closed in the rhythm of the formation's movement and that required the kind of reflexive, instinctive response that came only from training so repetitive it had become muscular memory rather than conscious decision. The ancient sources have a phrase for this press, theophismos, borrowed from the Greek, that describes the pushing engagement of two formed bodies of infantry, and modern scholars have debated extensively about how literally to interpret it. Was ancient close-order combat primarily a physical pushing match in which the weight and cohesion of the formation were the decisive factors, with individual weapons use happening in the gaps and margins? Or was there more open-order fighting than the formal descriptions suggest, with formations loosening on contact into something more fluid? Historians still argue about the precise mechanics of ancient infantry combat, and the truth is probably that different battles and different phases of the same battle involved different qualities of engagement. The tight press of matched formations, the more open fighting that occurred when one side began to break, the chaotic individual combat of a pursuit or a rout. What is not in dispute is that it was loud and hot and physically exhausting in a way that went beyond ordinary fatigue into something more fundamental. The noise of close-order battle, the crash of shields, the screaming of men and commanders, the rhythmic chanting that some units used to maintain cohesion and morale, the percussion of metal on metal and metal on wood, was overwhelming in a way that the human auditory system was simply not designed to process. Commands became inaudible. The trumpet signals that coordinated tactical movements could be lost in the din. Soldiers fought by the feel of their formation, by the pressure of the man beside them, by the training that had made their responses automatic, because in that noise there was no room for deliberation. The heat was remarkable. Full armor, helmet, cuirass, shield, in the physical exertion of close-order battle, on a Mediterranean summer day or in any sufficiently warm climate, produced a body temperature load that modern athletic science would classify as dangerous within minutes. Roman soldiers fought in conditions of severe thermal stress, and the fatigue that accumulated during sustained engagement was the fatigue not just of muscular effort but of thermoregulation, of a body working hard to manage its own temperature while simultaneously being asked to perform at maximum physical output. Water was not available during the engagement. You fought with what you had in your body when the lines met. The rotation system, the ability of Roman formations to cycle fresh troops to the front while exhausted soldiers stepped back, was one of the organizational features that gave the Roman army a significant advantage in sustained engagements. fresh men fighting tired opponents are, other things being equal, going to win that exchange, and the Roman training and drill system was specifically designed to make rotation under combat conditions possible. A difficult maneuver that required the formation to open gaps at the right moment, allow men to move through or around each other, and close again without the whole structure collapsing. Done well, it allowed a Roman force to sustain combat effectiveness over a longer period than opponents fighting without rotation. Done poorly, it created chaos. The difference between the two outcomes was, again, training. The testudo, the famous tortoise formation, with shields locked overhead and at the sides to create an armored shell, was not a combat formation in the sense of being used for fighting. It was a movement formation, used specifically to approach fortified positions under missile fire, the shields protecting the formation from arrows and stones raining down from above. Moving in testudo was slow and required precise coordination, every man in the formation maintaining his shield position while simultaneously moving his feet and staying in contact with his neighbors. It was claustrophobic, hot, heavy, and effective, the classic Roman military combination of properties. The noise inside a testudo under missile bombardment was extraordinary. The impacts of arrows and sling stones on the locked shield surface producing a drumming that was both practically deafening and psychologically intense in ways that made the slower pace of movement inside the formation feel simultaneously interminable and strangely protective. Siege warfare was its own extended misery, deserving specific acknowledgement because it occupied a significant portion of Roman military activity and because the experience of conducting a siege, as opposed to defending one, was one of prolonged engineering labor interspersed with episodes of acute danger. Roman siege technique was sophisticated and comprehensive. Circumvallation lines, siege towers, battering rams, artillery, the ballistae and onagri that hurled stones and bolts at fortifications, all represented genuine engineering achievement. Building them required the soldiers conducting the siege. The men digging the circumvallation trenches were under fire from the garrison being besieged. The men pushing the siege towers forward were under fire. The men operating the battering ram were under fire, protected by a penthouse roof construction that was theoretically sufficient and in practice variable in its effectiveness. Caesar's siege of Alesia in 52 BCE, the engagement that effectively ended the Great Gallic Revolt of Vercingetorix, required his army to construct simultaneously an inner circumvallation line facing the besieged town and an outer contravallation line facing the Gallic relief army that arrived to break the siege. The Roman army, in other words, built a siege line and then built another siege line around themselves, so that they were simultaneously besieging Alesia and defending their own position against the relief force. The engineering achievement was extraordinary. The physical toll on the soldiers who built 30 kilometers of fieldworks and then defended them against attacks from both sides simultaneously was, presumably, also extraordinary. Caesar's account of the battle is a masterpiece of self-promotion. Reading it while trying to imagine the experience from inside the formations rather than from the command post gives a somewhat different quality to the achievement. After the battle, if you are still alive after the battle, which is not guaranteed, there is the immediate aftermath, which has its own specific character. The battlefield smells of blood and open bodies and the particular sharp quality of metal that has been used for violence. And this is a smell that the ancient sources rarely describe directly, but that the human body registers with a depth that bypasses language. You are still in your armor. You are exhausted in the way that close combat exhausts, not the steady depletion of the march, but the sudden total drain of the fight, the crash that follows the flooding away of whatever the body uses to get through those minutes or hours. Your hands may be shaking. This is normal. You find a place to sit. The wounded need attending. Your companions are checking each other, the small inventory of who is present and who is not, the accounting that happens in every military unit after every engagement. Someone is missing. Someone else has a wound that needs pressure applied now, immediately, before the blood loss compounds the shock. The Medici are moving through the field. You do what you can with what you have while they work their way to you. The dead are gathered and, where possible, cremated or buried with the appropriate rites, the burial club, the collegium, that monthly deduction from your pay, this is what it was for. The funerary provision that ensured even a soldier who died far from home received something approximating the proper send-off, the coins for the ferryman, the name on a stone if there was a stone to put it on. Roman soldiers cared deeply about proper burial. The The sources preserve a consistent thread of anxiety about dying without funeral rites, about bodies left on foreign soil without appropriate ceremony. This was not merely superstition. It was the assertion of personhood, the claim that this body, which the army had used so comprehensively, had belonged to a person who deserved to be remembered. You survived this one. There will be others. The sun is lower now. The field is quieter, in the particular way that a place is quieter after it has been very loud. The armor is heavy and your body has strong opinions about the weight of it. You survived this one. The enemy, when there is one, is almost a relief. This sounds like provocation, but it is not. It is simply the honest account of what happens to a human mind when you put it on the edge of the known world for years at a time with nothing particular happening. The frontier is vast and mostly quiet, and the quiet has a quality that is different from the quiet of peace. It is the quiet of waiting, of not knowing, of scanning the tree line or the desert horizon or the gray northern sea with the specific alertness of someone who has been told, repeatedly and with institutional emphasis, that something might come from that direction, and that when it does, it will be his personal responsibility to notice it first. Nothing comes. Then nothing comes again. Then nothing comes for another 3 months, and by this point the nothing is so consistent and so complete that you begin to have a complicated relationship with it, simultaneously grateful for the absence of violence and unmoored by the absence of purpose, which are not the same thing but which the frontier has a talent for making feel identical. The permanent frontier postings of the Roman Imperial Army, the garrisons strung along Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, the forts dotting the Rhine and Danube lines, the desert installations of North Africa and Syria, the scattered outposts at the edges of Roman influence in all directions, represented the long-term reality of Roman military service for a very large proportion of the men who served. The legions were stationed for decades at particular locations. Individual soldiers served out entire careers in the same province, sometimes in the same fort. The transfer between units and postings happened, but the image of the Roman soldier as a perpetual campaigner moving constantly across the empire is, for most men in most periods, somewhat misleading. Many soldiers spent the majority of their service in one place, watching the same horizon, maintaining the same walls, conducting the same patrols along the same roads. This has implications that deserve examination. The psychological literature on prolonged isolation and boredom in military contexts, a literature that has grown substantially in the modern period, drawing on the experiences of soldiers in remote postings from Antarctica to the Arctic to isolated island garrisons, consistently identifies a particular cluster of difficulties that arise not from combat stress but from its opposite, the chronic understimulation, the loss of meaningful purpose, the erosion of individual identity that occurs when days are identical and the institutional routine has been repeated so many times that it no longer requires any cognitive engagement to perform. The Romans did not have this literature. They had the experiences it describes. The daily routine of a frontier garrison soldier was, in its structural outline, predictable to a degree that defies easy description. Reveille before dawn. Morning assembly and roll call. The tesserarius distributed the watchword for the day, the password that identified you as a legitimate member of the garrison rather than an infiltrator, changed daily with the bureaucratic regularity that the Roman army applied to everything it touched. Inspection of equipment and weapons. Assigned duties which varied by roster position. Patrol, construction and maintenance work, administrative tasks for the literate, supply management, training, always training, the endless repetition of drill that kept the military machine from rusting in the absence of actual use. The afternoon brought more duties or, occasionally, the relatively unstructured time that was the frontier garrison's version of leisure. Evening meal, evening assembly, night watch for those assigned to it. Sleep, or the attempt at sleep, in the barracks that you have long since ceased to perceive as anything other than the default state of existence. Repeat. For years, the Roman military administration was aware that a bored garrison was a problematic garrison, and the training schedule was in part a response to this, keeping men occupied, keeping their skills from deteriorating, giving the days a structure that provided forward momentum even when the frontier itself offered none. Building and maintenance projects served the same function. There was always a wall that needed repointing, a road that needed resurfacing, a drainage ditch that had silted up and required clearing, a new structure of some kind that the camp prefect had decided was necessary. The Roman army's relationship with construction was not purely strategic. It was also therapeutic, in the sense that physical labor is therapeutic for populations at risk of the particular dysfunction that comes from purposelessness. But construction projects and training schedules have their limits, and the frontier soldier found his own supplements to the official program of occupation. The evidence for what Roman soldiers actually did with their time, preserved in graffiti, in personal letters, in the artifacts recovered from fort sites and their associated refuse deposits, is one of the more humanizing bodies of evidence from the ancient world, precisely because it shows men being recognizably human in the gaps of the institutional record. Gambling, as already noted, was endemic. The prohibition existed. The dice continued to be thrown. Excavations of Roman fort sites consistently produced gaming pieces, knucklebones, carved bone or clay dice, gaming boards scratched into stone or tile, in quantities that speak to the centrality of games of chance to the soldier's recreational economy. The stakes were presumably modest in ordinary times, given that ordinary times did not provide much to stake, but the combination of small amounts of disposable income, abundant time, and the social bonding function of competitive play made gambling the perennial recreational institution of the frontier garrison. Hunting was another outlet available in many frontier postings, and it occupied an interesting dual position, officially sanctioned as a form of training and physical conditioning, as well as a supplement to the food supply, while simultaneously functioning as a genuine leisure activity with the psychological benefits of outdoor movement, individual skill expression, and the satisfaction of an outcome that was not entirely predetermined by the institutional schedule. Inscriptions from frontier sites record soldiers making dedications to hunting deities, and the faunal remains from fort refuse deposits show the presence of game animals alongside the domestic species of the official food supply. Soldiers hunted. They probably enjoyed hunting. The frontier, whatever its psychological liabilities, did in many postings provide access to countryside that was genuinely wild and genuinely interesting to a person with a javelin and a few hours of unofficial freedom. The letter home, or more precisely, the letter to the people who occupied the space where home had been, is one of the most affecting artifacts of Roman military life, and we are fortunate to have a number of them, preserved primarily in the dry conditions of Egypt and in the anaerobic waterlogged deposits of sites like Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall. The Vindolanda tablets, thin wooden writing tablets, roughly the size of a modern postcard, covered in ink writing that survived nearly 2,000 years in waterlogged ground, preserve a snapshot of life on the northern British frontier at the turn of the 2nd century CE that is extraordinary in its intimacy. Here is the quirky historical tidbit for this section, and it earns the designation because of the specific collision it produces between the ancient and the immediately recognizable. Among the Vindolanda tablets is a letter from a soldier named Masculus to his commanding officer, Flavius Cerealis, requesting instructions about what the unit should be doing and noting, in terms that translate across the centuries with uncomfortable clarity, that the men are running low on beer. Not wine, beer, the cerveza that the northern British climate and the supply chain of the frontier made more readily available than the Mediterranean staple. A Roman soldier on Hadrian's Wall, writing to his commander for operational guidance, taking a moment to flag the beer situation. The letter is nearly 2,000 years old. The feeling it conveys is not. Other tablets record requests for socks, underpants, and sandals from family members back home. The frontier was cold, the supply of personal clothing items was apparently insufficient, and soldiers wrote home asking their relatives to send them warm things in the same register that soldiers have used in every subsequent era. One letter, from a man named Claudia Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina, the wife of the fort commander, is the earliest known example of Latin written by a woman, and it is an invitation to a birthday party, a document of social life on the frontier that reminds you that the Vicus settlement outside the fort walls was inhabited by real people with real social networks and real birthdays that were apparently worth celebrating even in the rain. The letters reveal homesickness, naturally, but they also reveal something more interesting, the degree to which frontier soldiers built lives where they were, forming the attachments and routines and social networks that made the posting survivable over the long term. The woman in the Vicus, the children who were not legally acknowledged but were practically present, the friendships formed across years of shared service in the same location. These constituted a life. even if it was not the life that Roman law officially recognized or that civilian society would have understood as properly formed. Religion on the frontier was a particularly rich and diverse phenomenon, and we touched on Mithraism earlier as an example of the mystery religions that spread through the military. The frontier soldiers' religious life is documented in the extraordinary number of altars and dedicatory inscriptions recovered from fort sites. Soldiers making vows to gods Roman and local, official and personal, establishing the kind of relationship with the divine that made sense in the context of lives over which institutional authority held enormous power but individual fate remained stubbornly unpredictable. At Hadrian's Wall, inscriptions record soldiers making dedications to Roman gods alongside local British deities. Coventina, goddess of the sacred well at Caroburg, receiving offerings from soldiers who were far from Rome and apparently perfectly willing to extend their theological portfolio to include whoever the local divine landscape had on offer. At frontier forts in the Rhineland, dedications to Germanic goddesses appear alongside Jupiter and Mars. In the eastern provinces, Syrian soldiers serving in British forts brought their own gods with them and built small temples to worship them. The frontier was, in its religious life, genuinely pluralistic, not from any principled commitment to religious freedom, but from the practical reality that men under existential stress reach for whatever spiritual resources are available to them, and the Roman army, for all its institutional rigidity, did not generally prevent soldiers from maintaining the religious practices of their home cultures. The years accumulated. The horizon remained the same. The patrols went out and came back. The watch was stood and relieved. The training happened, and the construction happened, and the gambling happened, and the letters went home, and sometimes letters came back, and the children in the vicus grew older, and the centurion's vine staff made its rounds. And occasionally, something happened on the frontier that was actually the thing the frontier garrison existed to prevent or respond to. A raid, an incursion, a diplomatic crisis that required a military presence, a punitive expedition into territory beyond the official line, the crossing of the wall or the river into the space beyond Roman control, with all the tactical uncertainty that implied. These moments of genuine operational purpose arrived against the background of the long waiting with a quality that was disorienting precisely because they interrupted the rhythm of the nothing. You had spent months doing the patrol without incident, and then the patrol had an incident, and the part of your brain that had been quietly atrophying in the routine suddenly had to perform at combat capacity. The transition from frontier tedium to frontier emergency was one of the more psychologically demanding aspects of long-term garrison service, and the Roman army's insistence on maintaining training and readiness schedules regardless of operational tempo was in part a response to this challenge, keeping the soldier in something approximating combat readiness so that the switch from routine to emergency did not require a recalibration that ate into response time. Whether this actually worked consistently is a question the historical record does not fully answer. Human beings are not machines, and the capacity for sustained readiness over years of monotony has limits that no amount of institutional design fully overcomes. The seasons changed. The frontier in winter was a different experience from the frontier in summer. The northern postings in particular, where winter along Hadrian's Wall or on the Rhine meant cold of a quality that Mediterranean soldiers found genuinely challenging. The kind of cold that got into the barracks despite the heating system and that made the morning watch a misery of specific physical discomfort. The hypocaust, the underfloor heating system used in some fort buildings, was a genuine technological achievement and a genuine comfort, but it heated the bathhouse and the commanding officer's quarters more reliably than it heated the soldiers' barracks, which were warmed primarily by the body heat of the 8 men sharing each room, the small cooking stove in the anteroom, and the resentment generated by being cold. Decades passed. The face in the reflection of the bathhouse water changed. The man who took the sacramentum at 19 had less hair and more scar tissue at 40, and the horizon was still the same horizon, and the trumpets still sounded before sunrise, and the frontier held its position at the edge of everything Rome claimed and everything it had decided not to claim. That line in the landscape where the empire stopped and the world began. You watched it every day. You watched it until watching it became indistinguishable from the act of breathing, automatic, continuous, the background condition of being alive in the particular way that you were alive, which was the way of a Roman soldier on the frontier. which was a way that had very little in common with any life you might have imagined for yourself before the oath was taken and the horizon became your profession. The beer, when it arrived, was welcome. It was always welcome. The discharge document arrives on a morning that looks like every other morning. The trumpets sound before sunrise, as they always do, as they have done for more mornings than you stopped counting some years back when the counting itself started to feel like a form of self-punishment. You assemble with your unit, as you always do. The roll is called. The watchword is distributed. And this is the part that does not fit the routine, the part that your body registers as different before your mind fully processes why. Your name is called separately, and you are told to step forward, and the camp prefect reads from a document that confirms, in the careful administrative Latin of Roman bureaucratic officialdom, that you have completed your term of service and are hereby honorably discharged. Onesta missio. Honorable discharge. 2 words that you have been carrying toward for 25 years the way a river carries toward the sea. Not always consciously, not always hopefully, but consistently, in the direction of this specific destination. And now you are here, and the document is real, and the bronze diploma that records your citizenship, if you are an auxiliary completing your service, or your discharge payment, if you are a legionary, is either in your hands or in the process of being arranged, and the institutional machinery that has owned you since you were 19 years old is, in this specific moment, releasing its grip. The feeling, by all available evidence, was complicated. We know something about how Roman soldiers experienced discharge because they left traces of it, in the inscriptions they set up afterward, in the legal documents that record their subsequent lives, in the settlement patterns of veteran communities, in the letters and papyri that preserve fragments of individual lives at the point of transition. What emerges from this evidence is a picture that is more ambivalent than the simple relief narrative that discharge might seem to promise. 25 years is a very long time. The Army had not merely employed you, it had made you, in the most comprehensive sense, the kind of making that goes all the way down into habit and identity and the way you understand the world and your place in it. The veteran who walked out of the fort gate was a man who had spent the better part of his adult life in an institution that organized every aspect of his existence. He knew how to march, how to dig, how to fight, how to maintain equipment, how to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the Legion, how to survive physical conditions that would have defeated his 19-year-old self. He knew the smell of a leather tent in rain and the sound of the cornicin and the particular quality of pre-battle silence. He did not necessarily know how to buy food in a civilian market, how to navigate a legal dispute without the backing of the military justice system, how to structure a day that did not arrive pre-organized by institutional authority. The skills of military life and the skills of civilian life overlapped less than you might hope. The discharge payment, when it came, and we have already noted the circumstances under which it sometimes did not come promptly or in full, was the financial foundation on which the rest of life was supposed to be built. 3,000 denarii for a legionary at the Augustan rate was real money. It was enough to purchase a modest property in many parts of the empire, to establish a small business, to live on while you found your feet in civilian life. The land grants that had been a feature of earlier Roman veteran settlement, the colonies established in various parts of the empire populated by discharged soldiers, had largely given way to cash payments by the later imperial period, which gave veterans more flexibility but also more responsibility for managing their own resettlement. The veteran colonies of the earlier period, colony established in places like Carthage, Corinth, and dozens of other locations across the empire, had represented a specific vision of veteran integration, the deliberate creation of communities of former soldiers who would simultaneously occupy and Romanize newly acquired or strategic territories. The soldier who had spent his career on the frontier was settled in a new colony, given land, and became a civilian farmer in a place that had been chosen for him with the same imperial efficiency that had organized everything else in his life. This had the advantage of providing a ready-made community of men in similar circumstances, people who shared the reference points and the institutional formation of military service and who could build a civilian community on that shared foundation. It had the disadvantage of being, in its fundamental logic, yet another expression of Rome's ownership of your trajectory. The army had decided where you would serve, and now the state had decided where you would retire, and the concept of choosing your own path remained somewhat theoretical. By the imperial period, the cash discharge gave veterans more nominal choice, and the evidence of where veterans actually settled shows a consistent pattern. They went back, or as close to back as they could get. Men who had formed families in the vicus outside their fort, the long-term partners, the technically illegitimate children who were now, with the grant of citizenship, legitimized, stayed in the communities they had actually built during their service. The woman who had waded through decades of service, who had raised children in the civilian settlement, who had managed whatever household economy was available to her. She was already there, and the veteran came to her rather than to some abstract civilian life in a distant province. This was the other face of the discharge, and historians still argue about the degree to which the Roman state's official narrative of the veteran, the soldier transformed into a Roman citizen farmer, stable and settled and productive, matched the reality of what veterans' lives actually looked like after service. Many veterans remained connected to the military economy, working as traders or craftsmen in the vici that had grown up around forts, providing services to the garrisons that replaced them. Some became military contractors, supplying the army with goods and services from a civilian position. A surprising number returned to military service in some capacity, as beneficiaries, as administrative staff, as the kind of experienced men that the army found useful in roles that did not require full frontline service. The medical reality of the veteran's body deserves acknowledgement at this point, because the physical legacy of military service was carried into civilian life in ways that shaped its possibilities. Skeletal evidence from veteran populations shows the accumulated record of the career, old fractures healed with varying degrees of success, joint degeneration consistent with decades of heavy load-bearing, dental wear, the traces of wounds taken and recovered from, the general signature of bodies that had been used very hard for a very long time. A man discharged at 44 after 25 years of service was not, by any reasonable measure, a young man. He was a man whose body had been the instrument of Rome's military ambition for a quarter century, and the body kept the accounts of this even when the official record moved on. Arthritis was probably universal among veteran populations. Chronic back pain, the souvenir of all those years of pack carrying, was a near certainty. The shoulder that shifted badly in that river crossing 21 years ago had never quite worked the same way. And now in cold weather it announced itself with a persistence that the medicus would have diagnosed as a humeral imbalance and that modern medicine would recognize as the onset of the joint deterioration that follows unrepaired soft tissue damage. You managed it. You managed it because managing things was what you did, what 25 years of military service had made the fundamental cognitive habit of your existence. The children, those children in the vicus who had grown up watching the fort and the soldiers and the rhythms of military life with the familiarity of people for whom this was simply the world, occupied their own complicated position in the veteran's life. Legally legitimized at the point of their father's discharge, they were now Roman citizens, which was the promise that the auxiliary service had been made in exchange for and which was real and meaningful in the legal and social landscape of the empire. But they had grown up outside the walls in the civilian settlement, with a mother who had managed their existence through the long years of their father's service, and the father who came home at discharge was in some ways a stranger, the man whose name they knew, whose occasional presence during leave they remembered, but whose daily reality had been the fort rather than the family for their entire lives. This did not always resolve cleanly. The emotional mathematics of family life, interrupted by 25 years of institutional absence, were complicated in the ancient world in precisely the ways they are complicated in any world, because human attachment and human expectation do not adjust gracefully to the demands of military service simply because the service is officially mandated. The veteran who came home or stayed where home had become had to rebuild or build for the first time the texture of a civilian family life, with a set of relational skills that the Army had not exactly prioritized in its training curriculum. Religion continued to matter enormously to veterans, and the pattern of religious dedication in veteran communities shows men maintaining the devotional practices of their service years. The gods who had been petitioned before battle, the deities of the units they had served in, the mystery religion initiations that had structured their spiritual life on the frontier. The Mithraic communities that clustered around former military areas in the Rhine and Danube regions were in significant part veteran communities, men who had been initiated during service continuing their practice in retirement. This is a small detail with large implications. The Army did not release its hold on the veteran's identity at the moment of discharge. The formation went too deep for that. The man who had been a soldier remained, in the most fundamental sense, a man who had been a soldier, and the frameworks through which he understood the world, the hierarchies, the loyalties, the specific religious practices of the military community, persisted into civilian life as the architecture of his identity. Here is the thing that the discharge document does not say, the thing that the official record of honesta missio and citizenship grants and discharge payments cannot quite capture. What 25 years in the Roman army did to the person who underwent it was not simply a subtraction, years taken from a life in exchange for pay and eventual benefits. It was a transformation so thorough and so complete that the person who emerged from it was, in ways that went beyond the physical changes of aging, genuinely different from the person who had walked in. The sacramentum had not merely bound him legally, it had made him, and now he was unmade from it, or supposed to be, and the question of who you were without the legion, without the century, without the contubernium, without the centurion's vine staff and the pre-dawn trumpets and the specific social world of the fort, was a question that the discharge document did not answer, because no document could. Some veterans answered it with work, with family, with the slow construction of a civilian life that borrowed the organizational habits of the military, the early rising, the structured days, the preference for clear hierarchies and unambiguous roles, and applied them to the different demands of civilian existence. Some answered it with continued proximity to the military world, staying in the fort's orbit as traders or craftsmen, or the older men who gathered in the Vicus Tavern and talked about campaigns with the particular authority of people who had actually been there. Some, the evidence suggests, answered it poorly, the veteran who could not find a civilian equivalent for the purpose and structure of service, who drank too much of that cerveza we mentioned on Hadrian's Wall, who found the open-ended freedom of civilian life not liberating but simply disorienting. Rome made promises to its veterans. Rome sometimes kept them in full and sometimes kept them partially and sometimes kept them late and occasionally, in the periods of political and fiscal stress that punctuated the imperial centuries, did not keep them at all or kept them in forms that fell short of the original commitment. The mutinies of 14 CE were, at their core, a reckoning with this gap between promise and delivery, soldiers who had given their terms and more demanding the accounting that had been deferred too long. The gap between what Rome owed its soldiers and what it actually paid was one of the persistent structural tensions of the imperial military system, and it never fully resolved, because the system that produced it, the combination of vast military commitments, finite fiscal resources, and the particular vulnerability of men who had surrendered their legal independence in exchange for institutional promises, was too deeply embedded in Rome's way of organizing its power to be reformed without reforming Rome itself. You fold the discharge document carefully. The bronze diploma, if you have one, goes into the container you made for it. A small wooden box, carefully constructed, because this object is the proof of who you are now in the eyes of the law, and the law's opinion of who you are now is significantly better than its opinion of who you were yesterday, when you were a soldier and therefore a legal dependent of the institution that had absorbed you. You walk out of the fort gate. The road is there, as it always is, that straight Roman road, remember, the one that your predecessors' arms built and your feet have worn smooth over the years of service. It runs in both directions from where you stand, back toward the frontier and everything that made you, forward toward whatever civilian life is going to mean in practice, day by day, in the specific and unglamorous way that all lives are actually lived rather than commemorated. And now, as we reach the end of tonight's long walk through Roman military life, let the weight of that pack begin to lift, just a little. Let the imaginary caligy come off, carefully, because the blisters are real even in imagination, and let the body that has marched and dug and stood watch and fought and waited settle into something approaching rest. The Roman soldier was not a hero in the cinematic sense. He was not a villain either. He was a person, tired, often underpaid, sometimes cold, always under authority, who did something extraordinarily difficult for an extraordinarily long time, and who carried the physical and psychological costs of it in his body and his identity for the rest of his life. The empire he maintained was real, and the roads he built are still there, and the forts he garrisoned have left their rectangular shadows in the landscape of 3 continents. Let that settle into something quiet and restful now. The legions have long since marched away. The frontier forts have returned to the earth, their stone robbed for later buildings, their ditches silted and grassed over. The men who stood watch there are 2,000 years gone, their names preserved in inscriptions that weather a little more each year, their stories recoverable only in fragments. a letter asking for socks, a dedication to a local goddess, a pay document that shows exactly how much was taken before the coins reached the hand. They were there. They were cold, and they were often hungry for something better than grain porridge, and they missed people, and they endured things that would have broken easier arrangements of a person. And then they were gone, and the grass grew over the ramparts, and the world they maintained dissolved into the world that came after, which eventually became the world you are lying in now, warm and horizontal and blessedly free of institutional obligations until morning. Let your breathing slow. Let the images of the march and the camp and the fort gate fade at their own pace, like the last light on a long day's road. You are not a Roman soldier. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. The frontier is quiet tonight. Sleep well,